moving on with our presentations, we have a keynote presentation by Professor Nnamdi Nwulu from the University of Johannesburg. Please, let's give him a round of applause. Please, let's try to keep clapping until they get here, just to keep the morale. 10 minutes.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I reckon I'm the last person to speak before lunch. And people often transfer the hunger and the aggression to the last speaker. And I've been told I have 10 minutes or less. So I would try to do the impossible. And it's very difficult for a lecturer. You know, a lecturer, you have 50 minutes for a lecture period, and you spend one lecture introducing the topic. So, so I would strive to do the impossible. It's good to be back in Ghana. I've not been here for a while. Thank you very much, Akwaba. I'm African. I'm West African all my life. So it's always great to be here. Very quickly, I would. Can you please share my my slide very quickly? But what I want to say is that okay, the title of my presentation is Africa must not transition into dependency. It must transition to power. It must not transition to dependency. It must, as a matter of necessity, transition to power. And by power, I do not mean megawatts, even though that's the power that we often are used to. And I will very, very shortly talk about what I mean. In the next slide, please. The next slide essentially, okay, it's working? All right, thank you. So essentially, I will not want to go through this presentation slide chapter by verse, but it depicts the challenges that we know that we are facing in the continent, which is actually the lived reality of Africans. Nigeria had 12 grid collapses in 2024 alone. South Africa, in February 2025, stage 6 load shedding returned. Right, and I know in Ghana, Domso has also, did I pronounce it well? Domso? Dumso. Yeah. In Ghana, Dumso is also, yeah, it's actually happening, right? No matter how much we try to deny it. So what happens is now that we are not actually energy poor because we actually have some of these resources. We're actually energy colonized. And now there's now a contradiction. The contradiction is that there's the double standard when it comes to the energy transition. And I think the various speakers have spoken about it, that the global north or the west, depending on the terminology you use, is abandoning that. I think the country representative for the UN said it's not economic, it's political. Right, but I have a different view. But in any case, the point remains now that most of these countries, from the US to Norway to even the UK recently, they were told that to remain competitive in the AI race, they have to move and they have to ignore most of their climate targets. Right? So what this means is now that it is African nations are told to adhere to some of these rules, whilst the global north is actually not really adhering to some of those rules. So what happens is now that we often hear about net zero, which is essentially taking cognizance of the fact that they will still emit, right, greenhouse gases, but they want to counterbalance it and to have net zero. Meanwhile, we in Africa, our focus has always been not zero. That is, you want to ensure now that people don't go to bed hungry. SDG 2 two. There is power, SDG 7, and then clean water, SDG 6. So we see now that there are two different approaches, right? It's not a difference in admission, it's a difference in starting position. And what I believe is now that there is an interconnection between food, energy, and water resources. And hitherto, some would say as a colonial inheritance, these sectors have been considered or planned for independently, right? Not in a holistic manner. And then we see isolated incidences, which are symptoms of much more systematic problems. So for instance, now Africa's median cereal yield is typically 1/3 of the global median, right? But it's not just a farming problem, it's an energy infrastructure problem, because to produce cereal, you also have to depend on the water infrastructure, you also have to depend on energy to process it. So all of this taken together, right, also leads to food insecurity. So these dependencies, this intertwined nature of these resources are not separate, but they should be tackled in an integrated manner, right? And that's where there's been this whole advent on the food, energy, water nexus planning as a resource approach. There are a couple of success stories. I don't have time to go through it. In Morocco, in Kenya, I can go through it chapter by verse, but these are just little wins, for want of a better word, where African nations have taken the initiative, right, and then have been able to gain success. This is some of the work we are doing, blockchain for carbon tax transparency in South Africa, right? I will just go through, I will not go through it in detail, I'll just talk about the key findings in a later slide in the interest of time, like I said. Just go to this. So now, as a way of putting forth thoughts about how we can move away from the current methods for ECG compliance towards what I believe is what should be the ideal framework, right? We should move away from the current methods and move towards what I term an African justice model that is underpinned by energy import dependency, right? And then at the same time moves away from all the financing contradictions that we have. Oh, just a second, I'm on the... Right, yeah, so it's underpinned by technologies, blockchain technology. There is now efficient data verification, right? And then some of the standards that are used are developed by Africans for Africans, taking cognizance of our local challenges. And you do not just have a case of transplant of metrics and then outcomes. The idea is now that you would have an increased outcome that would lead towards more dignity and development in the African space. I will go through the need for BIM and blockchain, and that's as an idea of using blockchain. Blockchain, I don't have time to go into it. Blockchain essentially is a technology that you think about it as a ledger system, a record-keeping system, right? So if you think about previous ledgers where you record information, think about it as a digital system, but now with this digital system, it's not just one person that has access to it, different people have access to it. This can be used, right, to ensure now that all of the ESG targets, like the case study I showed that we're doing in Johannesburg, people don't just self-report because people always have an incentive to lie, right? And then implementation, as Prof. Twala said, would not happen, right? Blockchain can assist, right, infrastructure governance, right? Blockchain can also assist ensuring now that immutable records are kept, right? And then the end result that we seek to have, we actually do get it. Now, I talked about these 3 case studies. I didn't go into it in detail, but the common pattern across all these 3 cases was that it showed ingenuity in terms of the technology design. It was Africans designing a solution for Africans, right? And then we were also able to determine measurable social and economic impact, right? And we were able to determine now that it was not just a case of technology transplant, which I actually have a problem with, but it was actually a case of societal impact. And it means now that these projects are proof that we can advance the conversation in the ESG space with homegrown solutions that can be replicated elsewhere. I talk about some of the requirements for replicating it elsewhere. There has to be sovereign infrastructure control. We talk about AI, I think Prof. Edward spoke about it. Who owns the data that we use to train AI? When they use African data, right, who actually has that data, and do you have ownership of the data that you're using? When you're using Facebook or using some of this other media and you're not paying for it and it's free, you should know that you are the market, right, for it. Some of the algorithms that are used, right, is it fair? Are algorithms biased to either underreport or ignore African challenges? So these are some of the things now that we have to look into. There has to be infrastructure control. There has to be PPI innovation for the majority, and there has to be ESG justice and not just monitoring compliance. Data sovereignty, I wanted to talk about it, the current situation, and then the need for African control. Yeah, the need for African control for our data, right? In interest of time, the key partners that need to play a role, the government, the universities, and I think it's always good to be in the university, right? We need to look at our curricula to be sure now that the curricula is actually fit for purpose. There's need for regulators, and then there's also the need for capital. I think one of the speakers said now that we need 10 billion or more every year to leapfrog and then catch up with our developmental needs. There is need for coordination, effective coordination. Prof. Tyler again spoke about it. Implementation. Policy is not really the problem, it's the implementation that oftentimes is the challenge. A couple of initiatives that were taken in this space, the Pan-African Food, Energy, Water Nexus Standards Body, African Blockchain Consortium for Sustainability. Those are some of the 2 initiatives that we try to advance in this space. And then there is the need for, obviously this is beyond my capacity, but we've written proposals advancing for an infrastructure fund that most nations can tap into to replicate those 3 examples that I had detailed. The choice before Africa is very simple, right? We can either continue with our dependency path, right, that is characterized by infrastructure and economic structure that is basically handed down to us from the West, or we can choose to leverage a sovereignty path that recognizes the unique challenges in Africa, the unique economic structure, right? In South Africa, it's called Ubuntu, right? An economic system that is inclusive and covers and takes care of the urban poor, that takes care of the informal sector, right? And at the end, the aim is to achieve, enhance energy security, minimize emissions, build tangible technical capacity, and achieve data sovereignty. So now the question for us as Africans is, which pathway do we choose? We can continue with the business as it is, or we can, what I call the sovereignty part, to ensure now that we really get power, right, in the way that we should. And that's why I said now that power in this case is not just megawatts, even though megawatts is important. Power is self-determination. Power can mean different things to different contexts, and I try to outline them here for a Kenyan, for a South African, for a Nigerian, what it would mean, control over systems, for an African essentially, ability to verify that any contribution to any economic activity is rewarded, right, as at when due. It's not just an African, it's not just a rent-seeking system that you emit raw materials to the West, right, and then you get paid peanuts for it. So we can use ESG as a conceptualized way to ensure now that there is not just power as a megawatt, and that's done, but it also leads to self-determination. My point is that Africa should not enter the green transition on her knees. She should enter it standing as a designer, not as a client. Thank you very much.